Hey everyone, welcome back to the lab. In this video, we're going to be talking about open source software and how unsustainable it is. Let's get into it. Open source software has enabled the age of technological advancement. It gives anyone access to high quality software tools for almost any use case, which in turn allows even small players to compete alongside large incumbents. In many ways, this is what's allowed the software industry at large to continue innovating for so long. Now, as an aside, let's think about an alternative reality in which software wasn't open. In this reality, it's likely that several large incumbents would build monopolies and buy up not just their competitors, but also the underlying technologies they depend on. So, I'm not just going to buy like your little AI company, but I'm also going to buy up, PyTorch, and maybe I'll go and buy up like Python, or I'm going to go buy up the Python request library, stuff like that. In this reality, competition would be dead before they even began. As is natural, innovation would stagnate, for if there's no incentive to evolve, then the costly process wouldn't occur. This is bad for normal people like you and me, as the incentives switch from providing value to end users to preventing others from providing better value. And I think we kind of saw this, honestly, a little bit with Microsoft, like back in the 90s, 2000s, where they really were building a pretty closed system of technologies with like their SQL Server and their C#, and even .NET. And they've gotten way more open in the most recent decades, but that image of them doing this is still pretty prevalent in a lot of developers' brains, and we kind of still look at them as like kind of a backwards greedy company. So it should be pretty clear like why we don't want this. And yes, we totally have monopolies today, even in the face of widely available open source software. So just imagine how much worse it could be if everyone had to pay astronomical prices just to play, building their own request, JSON or standard library, or enterprise licenses to use Python, JavaScript, and C#. Most just wouldn't play. So in large part, we should be celebrating open source software. It is indeed an incredible achievement that essentially everyone in the world is benefiting from. And yet, if we look just a little closer, we find that one of the key components of OSS, those that actually create and maintain these packages, is incredibly, horrifyingly underserved. This unfairness to OSS maintainers leads to a vicious lose-lose cycle of extraction from what conceptually should be a win-win virtuous cycle for all. This vicious lose-lose cycle leads to high rates of creator attrition, leading to large rates of high demand abandonware, which is basically when a project's maintainers leave and it just kind of sits there for a few years, never getting updated, and ultimately large inefficiencies in the entire software ecosystem because, a lot of us built on this really high demand package because we liked it, and now it's been abandoned, and like, where do we go from here? So in this post, we're going to be diving into the world of open source software and examining this question. Why is open source software unsustainable in its current form, and how can we fix it maybe? And so here's my executive summary for this. So open source software is inherently unsustainable because the currently implemented incentive structure between creators and users are not aligned. Creators being like the project maintainers, and users being like whoever's actually using that project in their, day-to-day. So on the user side, users can extract infinite value from open source software, while the creators often get nothing. And this is actually very true that they get nothing. Like they might have a buy me a coffee page or a PayPal link, and they might get even for pretty popular packages, they might get a few $100s a year, which you can't live off of, much less pay for the hours that they put in. So this leads to otherwise successful projects, that a large percent of a given programming language or niche or something is using, becoming abandonware, wasting resources on both the user and creator front. And so here's a description of kind of how I see this cycle happening in its current state. So the current cycle of open source software is basically creators build something of value. Let's say they create a little package that does markdown to HTML or something like that. Users then leverage that value. So, we're like, oh, I'm trying to do markdown to HTML in my project. I'm going to go to NuGet or NPM or, whatever your package manager is for your technology. And we're going to install that thing and we're going to use it in our project. And lo and behold, it probably does the thing that it says it does. So that's great. But then the users demand more. And so it's okay, I got the markdown to HTML, but now I want some front matter. I want to have metadata. I want to be able to embed tables in my thing, things that are related to the package, but weren't in the creator's, vision of what it was going to be. We're asking for more. We're not really giving more. So the creators don't really get value in return. And this kind of what I was saying is most of these projects, the way that they're supported is just on the side, on the weekends or something. And, they have ways to donate, but very few people actually do that. So these users are demanding more, but giving nothing in return. And so this is what happens. This leads to these short-term outcomes. So creators, they end up burning out because they're expending more effort than they get in value. value. And, we're just human. This is natural. Like, if you're doing things and you're not enjoying it, you're not getting value back. You're like, why should I do this? Which is totally valid. Maybe you shouldn't. And so now they're going to abandon this because, they're just not getting rewarded enough for the effort that they're putting in, even though there's lots of these user demands. And perhaps in some ways, because of all of these user demands, it's now turned from something they enjoyed to not. And so this is the short-term kind of abandonware. And like long-term, as we kind of zoom out and like what this looks like for the entire ecosystem. So what do they do after their favorite package doing markdown HTML, gets abandoned? Well, users are going to either spend a lot more effort to like fork this thing and now try to understand how is it working in the first place? How can I extend it and stuff, which takes like a lot of complexity. And now you've got to like maintain this, or they're going to find the next one. They're like, what is the next package that does markdown to HTML, and kind of like repeat the cycle. And so we can see how this vicious cycle keeps repeating itself from like the user stand. But I think it's also really important to think about what happens to that creator afterwards. So we can see that this creator just went from like excited about this package. They created this thing. They sent it to the world. Maybe it got popular, and then they had a bad experience. And so like, what does that mean in the future for them? It probably means that they had this bad experience and they're not going to want to do it again. Or if they do it again, they're going to be a lot more discerning in what they do. And so what this actually leads to is them creating less packages, often maybe contributing less to open source in general. And so now we found the lose-lose. Both the users and the creators are kind of losing in the current state of open source software. And so this is a vicious lose-lose cycle. It's a lose-lose cycle because we both lose, and it's vicious because it continues to happen and it makes the entire ecosystem for future cycles worse. Now, the more people play, the more likely it is that a user creator gets burned by abandonware despite high demand and decides not to play again. And that's why it's vicious. So in the rest of this post, we're going to be exploring the state of the open source software ecosystem. So what is it? How did it get here? Why is this actually the cycle that happens? Some more perspectives on what makes it unsustainable from the creator's standpoint. And then we're going to explore some potential paths to sustainability based on the information that we have. Okay, the state of open source. There's that saying that we stand on the shoulders of giants, essentially meaning that everything we are able to achieve today is largely due to our ability to leverage all the achievements of those that came before. Proving this is obvious. My life would be substantially worse if I didn't have ready access to water, electricity, and the internet, all of which are only possible due to the achievements of those that came before. We might call these dependencies we rely on every day load-bearing dependencies, similar to load-bearing internet people. And this is a post that got a lot of hype from, another open source software maintainer. And just linking it here so like this isn't coming from nowhere. Like this is actually like a common sentiment here. And so now we're going to call these things load-bearing dependencies. It's these things that like your system is reliant. It's like a load-bearing column, right? Like if we removed that, the thing would get like substantially worse. And so here we have this XKCD comic, which you might have seen before. It's called Dependency. You've got a link here. And basically what it's saying is like, we've got this like modern digital infrastructure, and like maybe this is like all software and stuff. And it's like this big software project. But if you look at like the system architecture of this, like we kind of make it like it's a building. Buildings and software have like a lot of, parallels. There's like this one single point of failure that's like holding up all of this. And this is just a little software package. Here it says some random person in Nebraska has been thanklessly maintaining this since 2003, but we're using it in our big project. And this is like extremely common in the industry, as we'll kind of go into a little bit later. And so the software industry is largely the same. There are many load-bearing dependencies that the majority of software projects and companies use to run. Some examples of these are like the requests package and like Python, or like Newton JSON in like .NET land. Like they're these like little packages often doing just like one like niche thing, but that is like required to happen a lot. So many of these dependencies have been built and maintained by a single random person who likes to tinker on weekends for years. Millions of developers use their work for free via the package manager of their choice in order to build their own projects, and indeed often use it for companies. Yet very few of these load-bearing dependencies and their weekend tinkering creators ever see monetary rewards for their work, much less rewards enough to pay for the time that they've in. And thus, if they can't do that, very, very few actually can get paid enough to actually support themselves doing this thing, even though they might have been putting in as much, work as a full-time job. They're largely thought of as volunteers in the industry, if they're thought of at all. And this is just so common. Like, when you need the markdown to HTML, you just go to the package manager and you just look at the reviews and see if people like it, and then you just download it. And like you never like think about who created it or who's supporting them or anything, even though you might now use this thing in basically all of your future projects that need this. So it's saving you hours and hours, maybe even like months of dev work to like get this thing fully working, but like you don't even think about the people that made it. You're like completely taking it for granted. And therein lies the problem. We have a single point of failure in our system, and there's very little incentive for that single point of failure to not fail. In fact, the extra load from people using that tiny package often increases the incentive to fail in the form of extra work for little reward. An influx of new requests from new people using your markdown to HTML or wanting it to like, now do front matter, do YAML front matter, now do 2ML front matter. Oh, it fails on like this weird dumb character that I have because of my like gen code. So many new requests when people start using your stuff. They're already building or spending hours building and maintaining the software and its build pipeline. So like things change all the time. So even if like their software doesn't need to change or their library, often you've got to like update dependencies, or you've got to like update your version number so that it still works with the package manager. And then of course, people are going to be doing PRs and requests and roadmaps and trying to get more involved. And like, on the outside, we're like, oh, you just need help. We'll just give you more help. But it's like that actually causes overhead for managing your package, especially when a lot of these packages were just like a single dev trying to solve their own little problem, and they didn't sign up for this. They didn't sign up for, dealing with everyone else, and they're giving it away for free, but like people are like the most demanding customers you've ever met, And that's the problem that we're kind of facing for these small to few, maintainer groups. Now in software, one of the driving principles we strive for is reliability. This is because if our system isn't reliable or isn't reliably doing what it's supposed to, then it's not a very useful system, and nothing else really matters after that. If your system isn't running and doing what we told it to do, then it doesn't matter how performant it is, how scalable it is, how easy to maintain it is. It's like not doing the thing we asked it to do. So it's not really a system. Single points of failure are a common factor for reliability issues, so we try to build redundancies and fallback mechanisms to deal with them when they inevitably fail, and they will inevitably fail. And I point this out to kind of show like how ingrained this is. So, the previous picture was like showing us that, we might have one load-bearing kind of dependency. But the truth is, the way software works is we're kind of nesting all these things on top of each other, which is great because you can kind of reuse one thing kind of everywhere. But when we do that, we bring in all the dependencies it has. So really, it's like if this is our software here and we know we have one load-bearing guy here, well, if we dig into what is this thing actually, we get a new system design out, and that thing also has its own unique load-bearing thing maintained by one person. And if we dig into another part, we're going to find that again and again and again, we have all of these single points of failure in our system that have no incentive to like not fail. And the more we use them, the more we ask them to do things without giving them, payment for that, we're incentivizing them more to fail, even though that's totally against our best interest. Because if any of these one things fails, we're in trouble because we're actually implicitly depending on that via whatever we're actually using it. And yet here we are building our entire systems on top of multiple single points of failure with no fallback mechanisms, and indeed an increased incentive to fail as it gets more popular. And like the fallback mechanism for this is like, kind of what I was saying is like there usually is a way around it, but you're going to either have to, go to the abandonware and fork it yourself and maintain it yourself, or you're going to have to go find a new thing, and like it's going to be missing features, or it's going to take time to like change it around. And so like there's a way around this, but it's just not as cheap as we would want in an actual reliable piece of software. And now think about like how weird this is if you're not from a software background, right? Like, can you imagine a sustainable system in which the more useful it becomes, the worse it works? And so like if this was a business, it would never open, because like the more popular we got, we're basically saying the more money we would lose. And it's like, well, why would we get popular? Let's just like do nothing. And if this was like software, we would re-architect it to scale, because we would know that like, there's a breaking point here. We want to fix this reliability issue. So we can see that in other industries, we would want to fix this. So it's kind of weird that like, with this one thing, it's so likely that it's going to fail. It's basically inevitable. We see it all the time. These packages becoming abandonware, but we haven't fixed it yet. Okay, so why do people actually build open source? So I think it's very clear why users use open source. They get free access to high quality software. But I think we need to spend a bit more time understanding why the creators build open source in order to come up with solutions that work for both sides. I recently stumbled on a post that does a great job explaining open source sustainability from an OSS maintainer's perspective. Really great post from an open source maintainer perspective, and I'll reference it a lot in this post, and I would definitely recommend giving it a read here. And he's got some cool graphs, which we'll talk about. And so in this post, the author explains why people build software as a function of their passion and monetary reward. And basically the function that they come up with is that time, so like the amount of time that a person is spending on, maintaining this project, is their passion plus their money. And so they've got this cool graph here. So you're saying that the motivation is the passion, money, which turns into time. And then there's like a demand side, which is like, how much value are people getting out of this? And so we can see that like for their blog, there's some demand. Some people are hitting this. They're looking for their articles and they also enjoy it. So like the enjoyment of doing the demand is higher than the actual demand here. And also I would say that their demand equals the work required, I think, which is implicit in here. So it requires some work, but people, want to see it. And so they're able to do it because their interest in actually doing this is higher than their work required. Now they get to their OSS project, which in the context of this post, they started off really excited for it. And then this thing happened where people started using it a lot more. And then there's all these demands and stuff. And so their interest was high and now it's gotten extremely low while it requires way more work than it ever did before. So the demand here is super high, but like there's no money because again, nobody pays OSS maintainers really, unless you're like part of like the top 1% of packages. And the interest is also very low. So it's like, this is totally not worth it for this person to do, but they are the sole maintainer. So it's kind of like probably going to be abandonware. Passion projects, you're very interested in this, doesn't really create that much work, or it might be a lot of work, but there's nobody cares about it. And then for the job, we can see that like it requires a lot of work. There's some demand and then your interest, and this person's obviously a little bit interested in their job, but they also get paid for it. So the amount that they aren't interested in it, they can make up for it. And so I like this idea, but I think a more generalized function is probably something like this. And that is going to be that motivation leads to effort. So the more motivation you have, the more effort you're going to have. And then motivation is going to be a function of interest and rewards. So this is going to be the interest you have for the given project or domain or, area, industry, stuff like that. And then the reward is going to be money, but also we can think of it like, why do people take jobs? Sometimes it's for the health insurance. Sometimes it's for the people, community, stuff like that. So I'm just going to call it reward to kind of encompass like the things that you get back. And I think this is a pretty accurate generalization of why people do things in general. People often don't do things only for money or only for reward, nor do they only do things only out of interest, because none of these seem that sustainable over time. There's typically some balance between these value sources that allows an activity to persist sustainably long term. It's also critical to point out that as demand grows in open source software, typically creator interest wanes. Now in the short term, after a spike of popularity, this interest probably increases, but as this demand leads to more and more requests outside of the creator's inherent interest, it will wane. So this is what I was talking about of like, your interest in building your markdown HTML converter, great. Now people start getting wind of it and using it. You're like, whoa, this is so cool. But then like the first requests start flowing and it's like, hey, this doesn't work for like .NET 6. And you're like, well, yeah, I didn't build it for that. So now you're like, oh, I gotta go change that. And then like more requests like that come in and you're like, man, like I just wanted to build this markdown HTML converter. Like I don't care about you. Who are you, random person? And these, honestly, a lot of these PRs and stuff that random people on the internet are making are like mean. They're like, this is the dumbest package I've ever used. And it's like, you're using it for free and like you didn't do any work for this. What did you expect? But that's just the internet for you. So anyway, this is similar to what I felt when I left software engineering to become a founder. I had more freedom and more potential for reward, but because the work required many things outside of what I was actually interested in doing, like marketing or sales or fundraising, my interest dropped dramatically. So it's a cool idea, and then you start actually doing the thing and you're like, oh, there's so many things that aren't the thing that I actually wanted. A path to sustainability. So how do we fix this? Well, it doesn't seem we found a paradigm that's widely worked yet, so it's hard to say for sure. But I do think we can pull from what works in other industries and implementations and see if that works here. In general, for an ecosystem to be sustainable, it needs to provide a virtuous cycle. In business, we call this a flywheel. Every turn of the cycle leads to a win-win for all players. This means that the more we play, the more the cycle spins out value and the more we want to play again. So here's a very like simple version of this. Like, you might put your resources in. If you're like a developer, this might be your time, it might be your effort, your thought, things like that. And then you're going to do the work. And then what you're going to get out is the value. Now, what is this value? So there might be some inherent value if you actually like this project. So that might be like your interest. But we can imagine that, in most cases, we're not going to be only one cycle. We're going to be connected to a different cycle as well. So like if it's a job, you're going to put in your time, your effort, your thought to produce some outputs, and the job is going to trade you in this value exchange here for for money. It's going to give you a salary. Or if it's a project-based thing, it might be like hourly, or it might be like per deliverable, or, whatever it is, you're doing this value exchange. But the important part is that every party in this cycle is going to come back here and reflect on what they just got out of this. Was this worth it? And so if in their eyes, the value that they got out is greater than in, then they're going to play again. And so this is how we get virtuous cycles. It's when we get vicious cycles that we don't like this. When a party who's in this system, and a system might just be one cycle, it's often at least 2 cycles, but can be many cycles, we can imagine, all connecting in this value exchange. If any core component of a cycle decides to stop playing, it's possible that the system entirely of all these cycles will now stop or run very inefficiently. And so if we don't have this virtuous cycle, then often we're going to have a vicious cycle or no cycle at all. So the cycle is either going to stop, or every cycle we do it, let's say we have a negative outcome, but maybe some parties still need to keep playing, and now it's actually negative overall for the system. If any part of our cycle loses the more we play, then that part will not want to play, and thus our cycle stops or becomes vicious. From our previous explorations of OSS and its creators, it's clear that the biggest factor breaking our cycle is the reward component. There are lots of creators with interest who start building packages, but the reward component is missing, which leads to abandonware despite the high demand, and again, perhaps because of the high demand and no reward. So the question really becomes, how can we reward OSS creators sustainably? Now, the easiest thing to implement would be donations. As people use software, they could donate to the creators and thus reward its maintenance that way. But we've tried this for years in the industry, and it typically just doesn't work outside the most popular packages, which in turn often don't give to their own dependencies. So is it really working for them? I don't know. Not enough people donate, and those that do are often just random devs giving a few tens of dollars, while the big companies actually making bank off this free software give nothing. This leads to the creators not receiving enough reward to continue. And this is that thing I was showing you where like every dependency we have usually also has its own dependencies, which themselves have that load bearing thing. And so it's like if you're really, giving a lot of money to Python or giving a lot of money to Kubernetes and stuff, but they're not passing along the funds to the load bearing dependencies that they're using, then they're still vulnerable to that single point of failure problem that we saw earlier. Okay, so that doesn't work. The next easiest thing we could do is just end open source software. At the end of the day, what we're trying to accomplish is a fair exchange of value between the user and the creator. And like it or not, we've actually come up with a pretty efficient way of doing that. It's called capitalism. It's truly the most meritocratic exchange of value with supply and demand controls built in, assuming perfect pricing. And this way, we ensure creators always get the reward equal to the value the users get from it. Again, assuming perfect pricing. But we also see how this one doesn't really work as a whole because it leads to the anti-competitive practices we explored earlier, so likely leads to a net negative for the industry. But at the same time, we do see kind of like really good software coming out of this stuff. I think this isn't maybe super common outside of like .NET. I think .NET still has some like enterprise-y backgrounds, but we get some really cool things out of it. Like Visual Studio is a really great IDE for C#. Maybe a better one that has better sentiment is like Rider, which is their version of like a really big built-in IDE. And it's like you could just use the open source like VS Code or something, which has a lot of plugins, which are great. But like by paying more for this value, we can actually support entire teams of devs to like think about the IDE experience and make it better. And so I think this can work, but it's not very common, especially when we get down to like package managers. And like there's usually like a few packages in every ecosystem that will be pay to play because they've got like, I don't know, some edge over the other ones. But the problem with that, of course, is because it's not in the public domain. If someone really wanted an edge in like, let's say, image processing or something like that, they could actually just like buy up the company that owns it and then turn it closed source and just like turn off all their competitors from using it. So that's kind of where we get these anti-competitive practices. Okay, so those don't work. So where does that leave us? This leads us to the middle ground of taxes. And there's probably other versions of this, but I keep coming back to, it's just taxes that's left. We've essentially explored the potential ways to solve this via strict capitalism. We give directly, in which case we have to rely on the altruism of a minority of whales, because that's how donations work. You kind of spend all this time talking to these whales and hope that a few of them give you some fundraising so that you can, fund your next year of operations. Or we force value exchange, which is, just the normal buy sell kind of thing, but that creates a value obstacle, especially to small independent devs who are just using this to like look at it. And it potentially opens the door for the non-competitive monopolies who could like then go buy up this package and not let anyone else use it, which we talked about earlier. So now we look at how governments typically solve for this balance between the poles of individual freedom and good of the masses and find governance and tax. In many ways, open source software is like a public service. If we think of our software project as a town or a city, then the open source packages we use might be a part of the infrastructure it runs on. Maybe it's the blueprints for the streets, the electricity lines, or the water pipes and sewers. If we didn't have these blueprints made available to us, then building our software town would be prohibitively expensive, at least for, all the small players, because we'd have to do all of that ourselves. So we'd have to find the architects, the electricians, the people to invent, the light bulb, things like that. We'd have to all do ourselves. In the same way, public services are expensive to build and maintain, so a town must charge taxes if it wants to remain functioning. And this is always the funny thing with people who aren't into taxes. It's like, okay, if we didn't pay someone centrally to fix our roads and take our trash and stuff, who would do it? And the truth is we have to pay someone to do it. So we could either pay a private company whose incentives maybe aren't aligned, or we could try to vote on something and get something that's more aligned for everyone. But the point is that, we have these shared services that needs to get paid for somehow. So how does this apply for us? So good taxes are typically value-based. If you use a public service a lot and or get a lot of value out of it, then you pay more to support that thing. This is mostly a fair trade-off and allows those that get the most value to support that thing more, creating a virtuous cycle, because as you get more value, you support the thing more so it can support you more. So it's, we're getting that virtuous cycle. Examples might be tolls on highways, which, a lot of people don't like, but again, highways are very expensive. So a great way to, pay for that is to only make the people driving on the highway pay for the highway. Or income-based taxes, which, again, also a lot of people don't like, but it's kind of the idea of well, you're getting more value for this, so we're just going to tax you incrementally. So you're always still making more, but you're also giving back more as well. Okay, so funding OSS via taxes. So here's another great image from that blog post I mentioned earlier about how this OSS maintainer is maybe thinking about supporting OSS projects. Now, this is not the taxes one, but I think it was kind of similar, and we'll be building on this a little bit later. So I decided to put it in this section. And basically what they're saying is there's the OSS project that the people like. I mean, there's a few core devs that are actually working on this thing. And so they are getting money from the product, and then they're improving the project as it goes. Now I've got all these companies that are actually using the project, so they're extracting that value. And the idea is that they should be contributing, right? So they can give money, or they can give developers, or they can give developers and money, some kind of mix of the two. And that's how we support this. So that's their idea. So in the OSS compensation post we mentioned earlier, the author is suggesting a compensation model like this. Compensation for the OSS project is going to be developers plus money. This makes it so that companies contribute some level of compensation consisting of either dev power or money, inclusive or. On the surface, I think this makes sense. Companies must give back value as they're the ones making value off of this. They can give devs or money depending on their own needs or the resources available to them. So in some cases, they might only have devs or money, so they can only give one, or in some cases, they might have specific needs, they need this package to work on some version of Linux, and maybe they are the ones that have the experts in that, so they can supply a dev even though they have money, something like that. It also allows individuals to still play with the open source for free, which again, I think is really critical for making sure this doesn't turn into an anti-competitive monopoly, is we really need individuals and small people to be able to play without these kind of obstacles to entry. Now, the problems with this are that one, there's just no requirement for companies to give. So implicitly here, these are all donating companies. And as we've seen in the past, donations just doesn't really have the uptake that we want, because you can get away with just doing things for free. Most will. And we just haven't been able to find a sustainable model of this yet. The other problem about this that I think about a lot is that dev power doesn't scale linearly. So I think this is common, but I think many people just get this wrong. And it's the idea of there's the mythical man month that if we just send you 10 devs and 1 month, we're going to get 10 man months out of it. So our outcomes will be 10x. But that's actually not true. And the reason is because we run into this problem of the too many cooks in the kitchen. So it's basically every new person you add to a team or something, it's going to add overhead. And that overhead is actually going to subtract from the amount that we're able to accomplish. The bigger the team, the larger the overhead, typically the worse the multiplier of what we can achieve if they're not split into smaller teams. And so this just has some inherent problems to me. So again, I think we end up in a weird place where only a few companies are giving, and thus we don't have a big enough monetary pot to actually reward the creators to make them want to actually support this thing long term. So again, they're still gonna leave in abandonware. And it's very possible that we end up with more unfocused dev power than is actually useful. So this is where we're sending like a bunch of devs who only are in it for like one project, or they're only in it for like 1 hour a month or something. And it's like, that's actually not that helpful because you're all overhead and you're not like learning enough to actually be helpful. So you're actually hurting, And I think another thing that this like misses, and we'll talk about it a little bit, is like the core thing we need is actually an owner. We need an owner of the package. And so if we're just sending all these devs that are like working part-time or just like 1 hour a week or something, if we don't have the owner, the whole project fails, because we need one person at least that can be like responsible for who's doing PRs, who's able to do these things, who actually has the knowledge to like let this thing in or decide it's out, who owns the repo. Because if we have 10 half-in people, we actually have nobody, because we need that owner. That's like the linchpin of the entire project. Okay, so instead, I think a more sustainable model is for every project to be run more like a nonprofit company. So their product is the project, and the mission is to make X easier via their project, and the only reason the company exists is to support this project. This allows the open source project to have a little bit more stability and separation from volunteers, allowing it to build an actual team for the project. This allows a core team to form, which can build expertise and vision through focused experience and effort with the project and the problems it tries to solve over time. Companies should still be allowed to provide dev power, but I think the OSS project should be more discerning and in control of who actually joins the core team. And like, I think if you've ever been in like a company, like you kind of understand this. Like when you join a company, it's going to take you like 6 months probably before you actually feel like you're up to speed and like doing things. So we know that there's this kind of like onboarding curve. And so a company just giving a dev for half time or like 1 hour a week, it's going to take them a while to onboard. Maybe not 6 months because it might be a smaller project, but like there's still that like onboarding time. And then we also know what happens to like parts of our code base if it's not owned by a single team. If it's just kind of like that random infrastructure that everyone uses, but like nobody's in charge of, we know that those parts of software eventually crumble or become so complicated they're unusable because there's too many people changing it for their own purposes and not thinking about like the long term of what is this thing supposed to do? How does it work within the ecosystem? And so if we want projects to not fail in these ways that we see software fail all the time, we have to use the practices that actually work. And for the most part, that is creating a core team that owns this thing. And that's one of their like core reasons for existing, so that they can actually build up the experience and knowledge of what it does and how it works, and also build off the vision of all the people of where it should go based on like all the customers and what they're actually using it for. And so this is why I'm thinking it needs to be more like a little company. And so this is where you have a core team of, for most packages, it can probably be less than 6, hopefully. 4 is like really great. And then a lot of times, again, we'll probably just see this one person because it's just a small package kind of thing. And so companies are going to need to basically, give the money. Maybe they can give developers, but it's the core team's job to decide if they should actually be on or if they just need to do PRs and not part of the core team. And then they can also like contribute code if they want like PRs and stuff. But really money is the biggest thing, because this allows the core team to decide how to like invest in the project based on what's actually best for the project, not just whatever's best for one company when you have like 1,000 companies that are using this thing. And one thing that's not in this diagram is we basically do need usage-based like projects. So like if one company is using your thing for like so much stuff and they're like super profitable and your thing is crucial to their thing, like theoretically they should pay more. But how do we do that? And so this leads to some of the problems with this approach. Now this model has problems in terms of overhead with respect to usage, funding, and organizational overhead. I think we're going to need some form of central project hub that deals with this overhead for projects so that they can mostly focus on what they're good at and interested in, the project. And this kind of solves for that problem of like, as your project gets more usage, which should be a good thing for you, a lot of devs get burnt out because there's just more overhead that they never signed up. So we need something to take away that overhead so that as you scale, we can still keep people doing the things that they're interested in and actually good at. And so some examples of the overhead that might happen, across these projects is like, what companies are actually using this package a lot and like probably should be paying for for it. This is something that like every team, every open source project is going to have to try and figure out like who actually is getting so much value out of this that they like, it's like a no-brainer they should be paying us. But for any one team to do that when it hasn't done this before is like kind of a ridiculous ask, so that this probably needs to be centralized. Another thing is like, how do we distribute funds and deal with taxes and store funds and stuff? Like, again, this is like, you're going from I just build software to like I run a company, which is a large leap. So if we could remove that overhead, that would be really helpful. And the last one is like, how do we actually incentivize funding? So like, you know, this company is using your software for free. Why should they give back? And it's like, obviously in this whole post, I've been explaining why this is for the greater ecosystem. This is actually how you do the value of exchange without like, you know, normal buy sell licenses. But we're probably going to need to make that clearer. And I think this is probably going to be similar across companies. So like maybe it's advertising, maybe it's like you get a big sponsorship thing, maybe you get, I don't know, prioritized support, whatever it is, you know, the overhead of figuring that out probably needs to be centralized so that these, you know, engineers don't have to spend so much time thinking about it and probably implementing a poor one. So by centralizing a lot of this overhead in the hub, it seems like we could get a nice trade-off between sustainability for projects without too much extra cost. And so this is kind of what I'm thinking, right? So instead of each project having to go through the overhead, can we move that overhead into this like holding, I call it a foundation here, but really I'm thinking of it as like a hub or a repo, like a, you know, a GitHub for these things, so that the companies can, you know, choose the ones that are most valuable to them and they can support them with the money, the devs, the code, but we still get that separation where the open source project is still run by this core team and they get all the value they want here without any of the costs of the overhead. Now, some examples of orgs kind of doing this so far are like the Open Source Collective, which basically is a nonprofit that handles funds for a cut of the donations. So it's handling kind of like the money side of things, like the transparency, what are the budgets, who's getting paid, why are they getting paid, stuff like that. But there's still like other versions, like if you're just a one-person maintainer, are you going to get donations? I don't know. So that's kind of missing. And then we also see the GitHub sponsorships where we see a lot of like open source devs like setting this up, and like if you give a certain amount, they'll like add you as a sponsor onto the repo. But honestly, in my experience, I haven't really seen many people using this. So we're kind of back to donations where it's like, you know, it could work, but nobody's giving still. So I just don't think we're quite there yet. So what's next? So these are just some thoughts from a random guy on the internet. I am not an active open source software maintainer, nor do I actively contribute to any open source software projects, nor do I think I will in the near future, given kind of the state of open source software. But I have seen many packages with a lot of promise and usage die simply because the incentive structure didn't work. And in fact, I still use a lot of these myself in like F# ecosystem, even in the C# ecosystem. I've run into several in like the Python ecosystem where it's like everyone uses this thing, or at least like, you know, there's hundreds of thousands of people that use this thing, but it hasn't been updated in like a year because like nobody's donating to these people. And it's just crazy. If no one uses it or gets value from it being like the project, then that's fine. Like it can die. Like there's going to be those projects that like we create that just like aren't actually valuable, or they're only like useful for you. They just don't go anywhere. And that's fine. That's totally fine. We don't have to keep those alive. But if we do have both supply, so interest and engineering power to actually build these things, and demand, so a bunch of people are having this problem and they need it for their company or something for a given project, then we have the opportunity for a win-win for everyone. Missing out on this, largely because we weren't intentional, is an unearned loss. So it's like this had the opportunity to be good for everyone and we just fumbled. We fumbled the ball. No, I believe strongly that every action is a vote for who you want to become and the world you want to live in. If you want something to keep going, you've got to support it. So support the open source projects that you depend on in your own project. If you like this post, you might also like the rise and fall of Ruby on Rails, which is kind of one developer's journey through falling in and out of love with the Ruby on Rails ecosystem. You also might be interested in stop wasting your time on bad startup ideas, which are kind of like my best advice for not wasting your time on like bad project ideas or anything like that. And the last one is your programming language benchmark is wrong, and kind of why we always benchmark things wrong in general. And that's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.